In 1945, the U.S. Army gave its soldiers a very clear order. Do not talk to German civilians, do not visit their homes, and do not become friends with the people you just fought a war against. But across occupied Germany, that's exactly what thousands of American soldiers began doing. And in one small German town, an American engineer would nearly get caught breaking that order. In the final months of World War II, American forces pushed deep into the collapsing Third Reich, facing the last remnants of Hitler's war machine. For years, soldiers had been told what Germany was like. They had seen the propaganda films, they had read the pamphlets, and they expected to find a country filled with stern, die-hard Nazis. But once the fighting stopped, many American soldiers encountered a Germany very different from what they had imagined. While many cities had been devastated by bombing, much of the countryside remained largely untouched. Rolling farmlands stretched across wide valleys. Dark pine forests covered the hills. Small villages sat quietly beneath church steeples and red-tiled roofs. 19-year-old Private Richard Kingsbury of the 94th Infantry Division later remembered his impressions of southern Germany. The frequent hills were covered with aromatic pine forests so thick with trees that they were dark and cool despite the brightest sunshine. The quaint little towns looked like illustrations from Grimm's fairy tales. For many American soldiers, it was a surprising sight after years of brutal war. The people they encountered were also not what they expected. By 1945, Germany had largely been stripped of its adult male population. Millions of men had been killed, captured, or were still prisoners of war. What remained behind were mostly women, children, and the elderly. For American soldiers arriving in these towns, the enemy suddenly looked very different. For some soldiers, these encounters quickly became personal. One of them was an American engineer named Richard Rurick of the 1255th Engineer Combat Battalion. Rurick was stationed near the rural town of Friedrichsroda, while his unit worked to construct a Bailey Bridge along the Frankfurt to Gotha Autobahn. It was there where he met a 20-year-old German woman named Jutta Christoph. Rurick spoke fluent German, and the two discovered they shared a love of art and music. What became a conversation slowly became friendship, but friendships like this were exactly what the Army was trying to prevent. Even before American soldiers entered Germany, Allied commanders feared that fraternization with civilians would become a problem. So under orders from Dwight D. Eisenhower, a strict non-fraternization policy was issued. American soldiers were forbidden from associating with German civilians at all. No social interaction, no visiting homes, no personal relationships. The official reason was to maintain authority over the defeated nation and ensure Germans understood the consequences of war. But there was another concern behind the policy, one that worried military leaders just as much. Sex. Venereal disease had already become a serious problem for Allied armies during the war. Military doctors feared that contact with German civilians would make the situation worse. The U.S. Army launched an aggressive prevention campaign. For the first time in its history, condoms were distributed freely to soldiers. Educational pamphlets circulated through the ranks, including guides like sex hygiene and venereal disease. The mission was blunt: protect your health, protect the Army, and avoid German women. To reinforce these rules, the Army produced a training film that every occupation soldier was required to watch. It was called Your Job in Germany. Its message was unmistakable.
You will observe their local laws, respect their customs and religion, and you will respect their property rights. You will not ridicule them. You will not argue with them. You will not be friendly. You will be aloof, watchful, and suspicious. Every German is a potential source of trouble. Therefore, there must be no fraternization with any of the German people. Fraternization means making friends. The German people are not our friends.
The policy was also tied to a larger mission: denazification. The Allies intended to purge Nazi influence from German society. Former Nazi Party or SS members were removed from positions of authority. Organizations connected to the regime were dismantled, and the leaders of the Third Reich were prosecuted during the Nuremberg trials. Germany was supposed to be rebuilt, but first it had to be cleansed of Nazism. But on the ground, reality quickly began to undermine the policy. As weeks passed, soldiers became less hostile towards the civilians they encountered. Many Germans were exhausted, hungry, simply trying to survive. And there were women everywhere, young women, often well dressed despite the shortages of war, curious about the American soldiers now living in their towns. Slowly, quietly, the rules began to break. For many Germans, American soldiers seemed very different from their own men. Americans were relaxed, casual, confident. Christa Runke of Berlin later wrote, "At first they saw us all as Nazis, but they soon relaxed. And they seemed so well off, so good-looking and casual. They stood for the whole American way of life. They were hard to resist." Across occupied Germany, it was not uncommon to see American soldiers in dress uniforms mingling with young Frauleins in cafes and bars. Richard and Jutta continued seeing each other quietly in Friedrichsroda while the bridge was being completed. One afternoon, they were walking together through the fields outside town. They stopped to take a photograph, and at that exact moment, an army jeep pulled up right beside them. Inside was Rerich's company commander. They had been caught fraternizing. Eventually, Richard's battalion moved on, and Jutta relocated to the devastated port city of Hamburg. But the friendship didn't end there. The two continued writing letters for years afterwards. Richard even sent Jutta care packages, food and supplies that were incredibly valuable in starving post-war Germany. Their story was just one of thousands occurring across the occupied areas. By late 1945, fraternization had become widespread. The policy was simply impossible to enforce. Faced with constant violations and dissatisfaction among the troops, the U.S. Army quietly abandoned the ban. Former enemies were now living side by side. Within a few years, the world would change again. The Cold War was beginning. Germany, once the enemy, was becoming a crucial ally of the United States. Denazification faded, and former German scientists and engineers would even help power America's technological race against the Soviet Union. The Army had once said the German people were not friends. But in the ruins of war, former enemies sometimes become something else entirely. Human. If you are interested in learning more about Richard and Jutta's story, check out my book, The Lost Letters of Hamburg, A Story of War, Friendship, and Correspondence, which recounts Richard's war story with the 1255th Engineers and his friendship with Jutta. Also included are over 30 of Jutta's scanned letters with full English translations. The Lost Letters of Hamburg is available now on Amazon.